We good? Oh, man. It's a good day. It's a good day. So glad that you're here with us. Thank you for those who are also joining online as well. It's so good to be in the house of the Lord today. Like we talked about, we are in week 3 of a series we're calling Win in Romans. And the whole idea of this series is that we're going to go verse by verse, section by section, and really unpack what is being said here. And now, as a pastor, I think I struggle with a couple things. I struggle with things like, just kind of talking about things that are only positive messages. I think we kind of see out there, I know we want to hear positive messages all the time. Like we want to hear encouraging words. Those are important. But sometimes life-giving doesn't always equal just, happy-go-lucky. Right? Sometimes life-giving is a word that challenges us, that it's not necessarily something that's just going to uplift our spirits and we're going to walk away just happy. Last week was one of those weeks. So if you want a challenging word, check out last week. Today, a little bit less so. I think a little bit more upbeat and life-giving today. But I'm challenged by that as a pastor because I can see the Instagram reels. I see my peers. I see other churches, and I sometimes like, oh man, the highlight reel of things that traffic engagement, that get clicks and likes are like always positive. I'm like, okay, that's important, but sometimes we have to also hear what's going on. So the idea behind going through the book of Romans is that a challenge in us actually doing a study in the Word, how we read the Word. And it made me think about how do we read the Word. So I just wanted to make sure that if nothing else you get out today, maybe you can get out of how do I read the Word and apply it to my life appropriately. See, when we read through the Scripture, when we read through the book of Romans, for example, what we're trying to do is we're trying to discern the original audience. Who is the original audience that this letter is being written to? And what is God saying to that original audience? That is important. That is truth that we need to unveil. We need to unpack. We are doing that. And then sometimes if we can just read it cursory and say, hey, this is what to that audience, and this is what God was saying to that audience, and we stop there, we miss the application for ourselves. Right? So we also have to say, okay, what is God saying to us as well? Because we believe that the Word of God is living and active. Right? It's not something that was for one time back in the past. Let's read it like a book, like a historical book, and saying this is what God was saying to those people back then. No, what we believe is that the Word of God is living. It is active. It divides the truth, right? It is something that is appropriate for one time and all time. It's appropriate for us today. And so God has to be also saying something to us as we dig into the book of Romans. And so that's the challenge. Anytime you read through Scripture, if you're reading through a passage, maybe it's a verse a day, maybe it's a chapter a day, maybe as you're doing your daily devotions, you're reading through, God, what were you saying to them? And what are you saying? How does this apply to me? Not how do I want to interpret it so it kind of supports what my whole belief system, but God, what are you really trying to say? What are you really saying through the lens of this Scripture? And so, in one way, I think we need to be able to do this when it comes to Romans chapter, the whole book, but really what we've been talking about, is that there's a lot of conversation between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. There's a lot of division between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. And if we're not careful, what happens is we get caught up in this historical document of Jewish believers and Gentile believers, and we have to find ourselves on one side of this, or we just find ourselves as like innocent bystanders, like seeing. Have you ever been in that where you like two people were in a division and had an argument, and you're like, I'm not part of this. Like, you guys deal with it. I'm just going to watch from the outside. It's just like, see how this thing plays out. Sometimes we can read Romans like we're the person on the sideline, just seeing how it all plays out, and just, be like, okay, well, none of that applied to me, so I'm just going to go about my life. That's not what is happening here. So if only there was something in our culture that, that, was divisive, that we could relate to, 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 that we could relate to If only, I think we need to kind of make this thing a little bit more modern. And so what I would encourage us to do, at least for today, is what we should do is take the Jew and Gentile division part of the conversation, and we kind of say, hey, what if it was like somebody who is church, like you've been in church a long time. Maybe you were born and raised in church. Anybody? I was born and raised in church. I was fourth generation in my home church in Ohio. Like my great grandfather went to that church. My grandfather and my father and myself. Like I remember being in that church all the time. So maybe there's people who are born and raised in church, and maybe people who are like, you know what, I kind of like, I agree with Jesus, but, they're in and out a lot. Sometimes we would call them, nominal Christians, like Christian in name only almost. We're going to take a look at that. Maybe if we read it in that kind of light, this thing would kind of come alive to us a little bit. So we're going to actually pick up our reading today in Romans chapter 2, verse 17. And to give you a little bit of backdrop, to kind of give you, not the whole thing, because I'd rather you just go to last week's message on the app or online and kind of get that. But just to give you a recap, there was a little bit of a division. The Jews and the Gentiles were coming back together, and Paul was basically saying the Gentiles were living this life of wickedness. And they were without excuse because the invisible qualities of God should be known to all. But guess what, Jewish believers? You're no better than they are. And so Paul was laying it out and saying, neither of you have the moral high ground here. And so he's continuing this kind of line of logic in his argument here. And in verse 17, he says, you who call yourselves Jews are relying on God's law, and you boast about your special relationship with him. Now, I love this verse because it kind of says, hey, there's somebody, you who call yourselves Jews. Maybe Paul's just poking the bear a little bit, but I think the part of it is like going, hey, I want to be in that crowd, all right? You who have identified yourselves as Jewish. You rely on God's law, and you boast about your special relationship with him. I don't know if you have a special relationship with anybody. I think that we're going to unpack this a little bit but the Jewish people felt like they had a special relationship with God that Gentiles did not have, right? Maybe you feel like you have a special relationship. Maybe it's with somebody else that other people don't have. I have a relationship with my wife that you do not have with her. Right? It's a special relationship. Okay? I have a relationship with my son that is different than my interaction with others as well. Right? We have special relationships. So Paul's saying, hey, you say you have a special, and you boast about your special relationship with God. Yet, you know what he wants. You know what is right because you have been taught his law. You're convinced that you are a guide for the blind and a light for people who are lost in darkness. All of that is good. You got a special relationship. You know what is good. You know what is right. You've been taught the law. You are teachers. You can instruct those who are lost in darkness. You think you can instruct the ignorant, it says in verse 20, and teach children the ways of God, for you are certain that God's law gives you complete knowledge and truth. This is a setup, all right? Paul is really good at setups. He kind of flowers like, hey, you got all this. And then in verse 21, well then, if you teach others, why don't you teach yourself? You tell others not to steal, but do you steal? You say it is wrong to commit adultery, but do you commit adultery? You condemn idolatry, but do you use stolen items stolen from pagan temples? You are so proud of knowing the law, but you dishonor God by breaking it. No wonder the scriptures say the Gentiles blaspheme the name of God because of you. Have you ever not taken your own advice? Given advice to somebody else, maybe somebody's asked for advice, maybe they didn't ask for advice, but you decided you were going to give it anyway. And then in the middle, I've had this happen to me, right? In the middle of like giving the advice, I'm like thinking about it going, yeah, I should probably do that too. That's some good advice right there. You should follow that. Right? Like sometimes we give advice and then we teach it. We're like, we know what is right. We know what is good, but we struggle to do it ourselves, even when we're teaching others to do the same thing. Paul is calling out this kind of hypocrisy of teaching others what is right and saying, hey, you got it all figured out, but yet you're struggling just as much as they are. And you gotta do some stuff. You gotta look to yourself. And what he says at the end there is that the Gentiles, no wonder the scriptures say the Gentiles blaspheme the name of God because of you. No wonder people who are outside the church say the church are full of hypocrites. No wonder, because they look at the lives of of people that are involved in church, that proclaim this great faith in God, and then they're like, you know what? It's not matching up. You may give good advice, but you do the same things. So if we can separate the Jewish believer and Gentile believer argument that Paul is saying, and hey, God is really trying to say, hey, there's something deeper here at work. You may know what the Bible says. You may know the truth about God, but it doesn't matter at all unless you actually live it out. No wonder the scriptures say the Gentiles blaspheme the name of God because of you. The Jewish ceremony of circumcision has value only if you obey God's law. But if you don't obey God's law, you are no better off than an uncircumcised Gentile. And if the Gentiles obey God's law, won't God declare them to be his own people? In fact, uncircumcised Gentiles who keep God's law will condemn you Jews who are circumcised and possess God's law but don't obey it. We're going to talk about circumcision today. I'm just kidding. We are, but we're not in that detail. That was something that separated them. There's this idea that there's something that kind of really there's a discrepancy between Jewish believers and Gentile believers, and this is what it was. The Jewish people felt like tradition was on their side. It was their heritage. It was the heritage of their forefathers. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was passed down from generation to generation to generation. And it's like they rested on that. And so they rested on it. Sometimes we can rest on that too. As people who have been following Jesus for a long time, or people who have been in church for a long time, we can say, you know what? I kind of know. I get the gist of it. I know what the scriptures say. I know what's right. I know what's wrong. I can kind of speak to that. I may not know everything, but I kind of get it. And so they talk a little bit about all of this. And so what Paul is really trying to unpack here is that the ceremony of circumcision only has value if you really obey God's law. But if you don't, it adds no value. It adds no value. It's kind of like the Jewish people were saying, you know what? I got dibs. Everybody know what dibs, right? Called dibs all the time. In fact, I saw a video recently that we were kind of scrolling through our videos, Jen and I one day, and we opened up a family present, and I called dibs immediately after opening. Now, dibs, I never get it. I just say it, but it doesn't mean anything really in my house. It's like the Jewish people were like, we got here first, Gentile believers. Like we got this special relationship with God. The rules don't really apply to us. We have this good relationship. It's preferential treatment. And what Paul was really trying to unpack here was that there's a difference between knowledge of God and doing the will of God. There's the knowledge of God and knowing who he is. In fact, Paul says it in a different letter in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. He says it this way. He says, while knowledge makes us feel important, it is love that strengthens the church. Isn't that so true? That kind of hits my heart a little bit. Knowledge makes me feel important. When I know something, it makes me feel special. It makes me feel important. It makes me feel like just proud. Like, hey, I know that. Sometimes we can boast about our knowledge in certain areas. In this case, our knowledge of God. But it's really love that makes the difference. It's love that strengthens the church. And what Paul is really trying to articulate is that you are proud, it says in verse 23, of knowing the law, but you dishonor the law by breaking it. He's saying disobedience actually equals dishonor. When we talk about honoring God, like we talk about reverence and we talk about just kind of like worship and respect, and I think those are all agreeable thoughts in our heart. In fact, we would say that out loud. I honor you. I worship you. You are high. You know your ways are better than my ways. They're deeper than, like, all those things are agreeable. But what Paul is really trying to say is that when we disobey his decrees, his laws, his commands, it actually means that we are dishonoring who he is. We can't see the two as separate. Disobedience equals dishonor. And I kind of thought about this, and I'm thinking, like, it's true in our own kind of interactions with our personal relationships as well. There's an aspect to if you are under authority and you disobey that authority, there's a little bit of disrespect towards that authority. We're supposed to honor our father and mother, right? If we don't obey our father and mother, it seems like there's a little bit of dishonor to our father and mother. Like, can we have an honoring culture? And I think this is what Paul is trying to say is you have to obey in order to really show that you are honoring and revering and respecting who God is. And then Paul talks a little bit about this idea of true Jew versus the untrue Jew in verse 28. I love this. It says, "For you are not a true Jew just because you were born of Jewish parents or because you have gone through the ceremony of circumcision." You're not a true Jewish believer. You're not a true Jewish person. And he opened the section saying, hey, you who call yourselves Jewish, you are relying on God's law. You boast about your special relationship. And then he says, you're not truly a true Jewish person unless, just because you were born of Jewish parents, but because you have gone through the or because you've gone through the ceremony of circumcision. It's not just the idea that, hey, you went through the traditions, you went through the rituals, you went through the ceremonies, and therefore you are a Jewish person. True Jewish people are about being the people of God, and we're gonna walk through what that looks like. But what he's saying is your relationship, and this is a key point, your relationship with God is your responsibility. He's saying your parents can't do it for you. Your heritage can't do it for you. Your tradition can't do it for you. Your attendance in church doesn't do it for you. You have a primary active role in making your relationship with God work and move forward. You're not a true Jew unless just because you were born into a Jewish family. You're not a Christian. You're not a Jesus follower just because you were born into a Christian family. Okay? Just because you went to church as a kid, maybe, doesn't mean that you're a Christian. You're not a Christian if you just gone through the rites and rituals of all these different ceremonies that sometimes we do to infants and kids in different denominational patterns, right? You're not a true believer if all that. You're a true believer when there's a marked change on the inside of you. There's a decision that's made on the inside of you. So what Paul is saying, hey, it has nothing to do about heritage. It has nothing to do about tradition. It has nothing to do about ceremony. It has to do with who you are, and your relationship is your responsibility. A true follower of Jesus is more about than what family I was born into or what nationality I was born into. It says, in fact, in verse 29, he goes on to say, no, a true Jew is one whose heart is right with God. And true circumcision is not merely obeying the letter of the law. Rather, it is a change of heart produced by the Spirit, and a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God, not people. What a powerful verse. He's saying a true Jewish believer, a true believer is one whose heart is right with God. There's something. And what he was trying to illuminate for all these people was that circumcision was what felt like a very kind of physical outward procedure. But what he was trying to illuminate was that it's really a heart issue. It's really an inward spiritual procedure. A true follower of Jesus, Paul is telling us, has a heart transplant. Now, a thoracic surgeon would tell you that the moment that a heart is grafted into the body, the surgical team, all they can do is wait and hopes it begins to beat. Some call it a mystery. Heart transplants are a marvel of modern medicine, but the heart transplant goes way beyond what medicine can explain or understand. It's more than a physical pump. It has a mind of its own. In fact, there have been scientific studies that suggest that the heart secretes its own brain-like hormones and has cellular memory. So a heart transplant isn't just physical, it's spiritual. There's something that actually happens on the inside. Now, in his book, A Man After His Own Heart, Charles Siebert's research concludes that transplant recipients don't just receive a new heart. They receive whole new sensory responses, whole new cravings, and whole new habits. Because of the secretion of hormones, because of the cellular memories, like when you have a heart transplant, patients say, like, there's something different about you. There's new responses to a degree. There's new cravings to a degree. There's some formulation of some new habits. It kind of lines up with what Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26 says, which says, I will give you a new heart and will put a new spirit in you. I will take out your stony, stubborn heart and give you a tender, responsive heart. This idea of a heart transplant, a true follower of Christ, a true believer, is not someone who's just all about, like, I've gone through all the different rituals and I've done everything precisely when I'm supposed to do it. It's marked by something on the inside, because life is filled with amazing moments, but nothing even begins to compare with that miraculous moment when you give your heart to Christ. That single decision sets off a spiritual chain reaction with infinite implications. A new child adopted into the family of God. A new name written into the Lamb's book of life. An old heart exchanged for a new heart. One that is produced, Paul says, by the Spirit. It's produced by the Spirit. True circumcision is not outward and physical, it's inward and spiritual. He's really trying to talk about this. So when we read this passage, we can't think about the procedure, we think about the heart change. It's a change of heart that receives praise. It says in verse 29, a changed heart receives praise from God, not people. It receives validation from God, not people. There's a difference. So something is happening on the inside that is life-changing and transformative. All of a sudden, you start to do different things. You start to think different things. Your heart has different responses or habits are forming. You begin to see the world through Jesus' eyes. Your heart begins to break for things that break God's heart. There's something that's shifted in your life when you've made a heart change to follow Jesus. There's this idea of a grafting in of a new heart, replacing a stony, stubborn heart with one that is responsive. Love that. So Paul, because Paul was a lawyer, Paul decided, this is good lawyer practice. He would think about what are responses to the line, the thinking that I'm laying out. What would be responses or questions or pushback or any of that stuff? And so Paul begins chapter 3 with kind of these rhetorical questions that his Jewish audience may be asking. And this is where it starts there. It starts about in verse 1, it says, "Then what's the advantage of being a Jew? Is there any value in the ceremony of circumcision?" And Paul says, yes, there are great benefits. First of all, the Jews were entrusted with the whole revelation of God. True, some of them were unfaithful, but just because they were unfaithful, does that mean God will be unfaithful? Of course not. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true. As the scriptures say about him, you will be proved right in what you say, and you will win your case in court. This is Paul really kind of advocating and saying, hey, so what's the benefit? He can hear it now, the pushback. So then what are we doing? Is there any advantage to being a Jewish believer? Like, I thought we had this whole deal. I thought we had this special relationship with God. See, the Jewish people were entrusted with, in some different iterations of the word, it says the oracles of God. This translation says the revelation of God. God's documented laws, his inspired text to be handed down, to be preserved, to be proclaimed. He's saying this is a huge benefit that you have. You have benefits from being able to know who God is deeper than the invisible qualities of creation. You've literally been given the laws and decrees and have heard the heart of God. You've been firsthand experiencers of the deliverance of of what God can do in your life. Yes, there are benefits to having been in that group of people. And just like that, we have benefits from knowing Him. There are benefits from knowing God. There are benefits from knowing Jesus. The benefits is that kind of this, there's permission and then there's access. I'll illustrate it this way. I should have done this. But I will give my phone number to anybody who asks. You want my phone number? I'll give it to you. You have permission to text me or call me at any time. I also have permission to block or, not take that call. Right? Permission is different than access. If my wife Jen calls me, I should answer it. Right? So there's this, because we know there are benefits to knowing God and being a follower of Jesus. There are benefits. Everybody has access to God, though. We all have access to Him. You have access to the Father whenever you want. Whenever you want. And Paul goes on to talk about some other arguments that people may bring up. And the first argument he goes into is kind of this glorified sin argument. I'm not sure if this would have been an argument that you or I would have had, but this is what he's addressing what he thinks would be some sort of retorts to his arguments. He says this in verse 5 of chapter 3. Some might say, our sinfulness serves a good purpose, for it helps people see how righteous God is. Our sinfulness serves a good, therefore, because we sin, therefore, people will be like, you know what, how much greater is God who is sinless? And so we should, continue in our sin because it illuminates the greatness of God. Goes on, isn't it unfair then for Him to punish us? We are doing Him a service. Through our sinning, we are doing God a service, is what this hypothetical question is, and Paul, of course, says this is merely a human point of view. Of course not. If God were not entirely fair, how would He be qualified to judge the world? But someone might still argue, how can God condemn me as a sinner if my dishonesty highlights his truthfulness and brings him more glory? Other words, like if I lie and God's telling the truth, then people are going to side with God, and isn't that a good thing? So I should just be, dishonest. And some people even slander us, and he's talking about, the apostles, by claiming that we say the more we sin, the better it is. It's this whole glorified sin argument. Those who say such things deserve to be condemned. Paul's like, you know what? Get out of here with that. Get out of here. The glorified sin argument is something that I probably would have done in high school, in college. I went to a Bible college, so I wouldn't have got that far, let's be honest. But I do remember that I had a group of friends, and I went to a college where we had curfew, so let's take that for what it's worth. So curfew means that you had to be in your dorm, so not necessarily in your room, but so we would sit around in somebody's dorm room or in the kind of common room in our dorm, and there would be a group of us, probably 8 or 9 of us, and we would do some things differently than maybe most college students would in their early 20s or late teens. We would philosophize, and we would have these circular arguments, the things that annoy people today. Let's be honest. In my life, and we would play the different sides and like try to get somebody to cave, and it'd be kind of fun at the time. But I feel like this is what we would do at that point in time. We would when my sin helps illuminate God's goodness. This argument of glorified sin, and then he kind of goes into this fairness argument. Isn't it unfair for God to punish us? Isn't God unfair? Isn't there this kind of fairness? And this fairness argument, I actually think, is probably something that the Jewish people at the time were constantly thinking about. Isn't it unfair that we went through all of history, where we've gone through all the different things that we've gone through as a people, and we've gone through slavery, we've gone through this deliverance, we've been exiled, we've been ruled by other nations, we've had our own freedom, we've had good kings, we've had bad kings, and now all of a sudden Gentile people can just be grafted in and be the same as us? Isn't that unfair? Well, Jesus himself talked about this, right? In Matthew chapter 20, it says the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers in his vineyard. He agreed to pay a normal daily wage and sent them out to work. He goes at 9 o'clock in the morning, finds people to work, sends them out. He'd pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. He goes again at noon and again at 3, and then again at 5 o'clock. He goes and hires and says, "Hey, how come you're not working?" And they replied, "No one has hired us." And the landowner says, "Go out and join the others." And then that evening in Matthew 20, verse 8, he says, he told the foreman to call all the workers in, pay them, beginning with the last workers first. Those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each receiving a day's wage. When those hired first, they thought, "Hey, I'm going to get paid more." And the landowner's like, "Here you go." And they're like, "It's unfair. What do you mean? They're getting paid the same as us." And he says, "Friend, I haven't been unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for the usual wage? If I wanted to pay the last worker the same as I pay you, that's my decision. That's on me." So the Jewish people were saying, there's a fairness argument. Isn't it unfair that they can just be grafted in and they didn't have to go through all this? They can just kind of believe. They didn't have to go through the ritual of circumcision. They had to go through this thing. Isn't it unfair that they don't have to become Jewish to become a believer in Jesus? And God's saying, no, it's not unfair. In fact, what Paul says is that even if just because we're unfair doesn't mean that he's fair. If God were not entirely fair, how would he be qualified to judge the world? Now, one of the things that just kind of gets all sports fans is the unfairness when it comes to referees. I call it a couple things, right? There's the penalty to the disparity, right? When there's if you're watching football and there's way more flags on one side against one team than the other team, or maybe in basketball where there's way more fouls against one team than the other team. You're like, what's going on? Or the other kind of very similar is the strike zone equity, right? Like what's balls and strikes, and you see people kind of lose their mind when a ball is called a strike or a strike is called a ball. Now, it's a little bit lessened when a ball is called a strike across the board to both teams. Where the people have a problem with it, right, is when it seems to be one-sided. It seems to be unfairly adjudicated, right? But when a ball is high and outside and it's called a strike and it's called a strike across the board, what do players have to do? They have to adjust, right? They have to adjust to whatever the umpire at that time is doing. When players are playing on the field and they realize this game is being called tight, I can't get away with the holding. I might get away with some other guy. I got to make sure I adjust my play to the rules. What the reason I say that is sometimes we think things are unfair, but God's saying, you know what? God is qualified to judge the world, right? It's qualified. Paul would say this is merely a human point of view, that we have unfairness and somehow we subjugate God to our view of fairness. If God were not entirely fair, how would he be qualified to judge? So God is fair. In fact, God is faithful. Even when we're faithless, he remains faithful, right? So there is no strike zone equity or penalty disparity or unfairness quotient. There's also no glorified sin kind of argument that we can make that if we can sin all the more, it just will show how good God is. What Paul is trying to say is, hey, this change of heart is really at the core of who we are. This is really what we should be doing and focusing on. Here's the cool thing. When you're a believer in Jesus, you have dibs. But you have to nurture that relationship. Salvation is not the end goal. Sometimes as a pastor, one of the most irritating things that I can hear is, can I still do this and get to heaven? Is it okay if I do this? Am I still going to be saved? Salvation is not the goal. Salvation is the beginning. When we give our lives to Christ, God goes to work. He's in the process of really making us into his image even more and more. And we start to see these new habits forming, and that heart transplant kind of transpires, and we see our heart changing and shifting to his heart. God goes to work. So the goal is, hey, if you're ready to make that decision to say, yes, I want Jesus in my life. I want a new heart. I want that stony, stubborn heart to be transplanted by a new, responsive heart. You have that permission. You have that access to pursue him and see that he is good. And so Paul's whole point in this section is trying to say, hey, we all have a special relationship with God. We all do. We have to do our part of that. So I want to pray for you this morning.